আমি হিন্দুস্তান পিটার্সের প্ল্যান ডিভিশনের সেলস ম্যানেজার।
কোনো রাস্তা নেই।
ফ্যাক্টরিটা কোনো অনিবার্য কারণে যদি বন্ধ হয়ে যায়,
Hello and welcome to the inaugural episode of the Chicago Dialogues, produced by the University of Chicago Center in Delhi in partnership with Prohor.in. I am Dipesh Chakraborty, a historian based at the University of Chicago and currently the faculty director of the center. Each episode in this series will feature a faculty member from the university in conversation with an eminent Indian academic or cultural personality on a topic of contemporary interest. Mr. Abhik Chanda, the well-known writer, has kindly agreed to anchor these conversations. We are privileged to have him with us. The topic of today's conversation is Satyajit Ray, whose centenary we celebrate next year. Welcome again to the Chicago Dialogues. Enjoy today's conversation and enjoy the series.
Thank you so much, Dipeshda, and a very good evening to you viewers. Welcome to this inaugural episode of Chicago Dialogues. This year, as Dipeshda mentioned, marks the birth centenary of the legendary filmmaker Satyajit Ray. The very mention of his name evokes the groundbreaking movies with which he had launched his career, namely the Oppo trilogy. Today, however, we intend to shed new light on some of the lesser-known contours in the work of Ray. For example, the subtle political overtones and undertones in his films, the eternal present-ness of the Calcutta trilogy, the selective use of leitmotifs, and of course, the uniqueness of his music. Hence, the title of this program, The Ray Less Traveled. And to bring these hidden gems to light, we have with us Borun Chondo, a veteran actor, an advertising personality and author with 6 published books to his name. He had played the protagonist Shyamulendu Chatterjee in Ray's Shimabodho Company Limited. And perhaps it's germane to mention that he's currently working on a book on Ray. We also have with us Rochana Mojumdar, Associate Professor, South Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. She is the author of Marriage and Modernity, Family Values in Colonial Bengal, as well as Writing Post-Colonial History. Her upcoming book, Art, Cinema in India, Film and India's Possible Futures, is scheduled to be published in the fall of next year by Columbia University Press. Mr. Chondo, Rochana, a very warm welcome to Chicago Dialogues.
Thank you.
Mr. Chondo, we'll get started with you. One of the things that strikes me when looking at the City trilogy, the 3 films about Kolkata, or Calcutta as it was then, is the choice of casting. And across these 3 movies, if we're looking at the male protagonist, he is not a professional actor, certainly not a professional screen actor. In your own case, as a protagonist of Shimabodho, you were well ensconced in the corporate world. You were an advertising professional. Tell us, why did he choose you for that title role?
First and foremost, I didn't have any previous acting experience whatsoever. And Mr. Ray had time to observe me for close to 2 years. Actually, before the adversary, or Pratidwandi. So I think, he was more or less sure what he wanted out of me, and he was sure that he would get it. But personally, I never asked him why he chose me particularly for the role of Shyamalendra Chatterjee. And he never volunteered information. Um, the But I got an answer of sorts from Bijoya Ray, Mrs. Ray, Satyajit Ray's wife. This conversation took place between me and Mrs. Ray well after the film was released, Shimabaddu. And in passing, she said that, oh, we were all convinced that, Manik will select Soumitra for the role of Shimabaddu. But then one evening over dinner, Manik said, no, I have decided to select someone who is absolutely new. And they were horrified, Mrs. Ray was. And she tells me in front of me that she was horrified because they wanted to have the stability of Soumitra, who was a veteran sort of by that time of a Ray actor. And I was an unknown commodity. So they had no trust in me, meaning Bijoy Ray and company. But Manikda was quite convinced that I would deliver. It's for the audience to decide.
Okay, great. We'll move on to something else that marks the City trilogy. And Roshan, I'll come to you. If we are talking about the earlier Ray movies, not just the Opus trilogy, but some of the later ones as well, there is this deep sense of history in the making, a commitment to historicism, right? Not just the Opus trilogy, but also in terms of the three movies that came after that, right? Historicism plays a major role. For example, Debi and Jolchaghor, of course, Chekhovian in its essence, and last but not the least, Charulata as well. Now, in marked contrast to these, Rochana, if you look at the City trilogy, and this is something that you've articulated in detail in your book, there seems to be, as you call it, maybe this ever-presentness or this long present, as opposed to historicism. What's your reading of that?
Thank you, Abhik. Before I answer the question, let me say how honored I am to actually be sharing the same platform with Mr. Borun Chando. Now, to your question, historicism, as you know, is a much debated term. I use it in my book specifically to invoke a sense of developmentalism, which is to say a sense of a transition from, say, a feudal order to a modern condition, from, say, an arranged marriage situation to finding romantic love, that is to say, a communitarian identity to individual autonomy. So to mark this kind of shift from a past to a present. And oftentimes in all of the films that you mentioned, the Opus trilogy as well as the ones that you showed stills for, the present in the films is actually the site in which the future to come is anticipated and negotiated. Now, what happens in the City films, by contrast, is that you have an extraordinarily happening present. A lot of things are going on. Gheraos, buns, bombs going off in movie theaters, accidents where, people, a lot of road rage, mass cheating, tons of things are happening. And yet, there is no sense of futurity. It is as if, as the film scholar Jennifer Fay says, we are, in a sense, we are locked in what she calls a present tenseness. And I thought that was a wonderfully evocative expression, present tenseness. And I think that is the feeling that marks Ray's City trilogy, where it is completely devoid of any sense of historical transition, and in that sense of any sense of developmentalism. You are in you're in a present from which there is absolutely no way out. And here you have a transition, if you will, of Ray himself from a historian par excellence to an ethnographer and into a documentarian of sorts.
So he's almost, this is a transition then from a historian to a documentary filmmaker, like a chronicler, presenting exactly whatever is happening as is.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I would, a documentarian, an ethnographer, maybe an anthropologist without a we know he has a historical sensibility, but it's almost as if he's refusing to give us any way forward into a future. So he's really locked in the present. Yeah.
Absolutely. And again, when one is talking about the city trilogy, one point that has come up repeatedly, right from the time that contemporary critics talked about it, is the politics or the absence thereof, right, in the Ray films. But to contextualize that, Mr. Chando, let's talk about office politics, which is overt, which is covert, which is replete, right? That entire movie, Shimabodho, is infused with the sense of politics in its manifold sort of machinations, right? What is your reading of his treatment of office politics? And because you were very much a part of the corporate world at that time, was it an accurate reflection of what was really going on back then in the early 70s, late 60s, for example?
I would imagine so, because what Monishankar wrote in the book and what Ray showed in the film was, by and large, a true reflection of what was happening in the corporate world those days. The elan and the suave camaraderie on the face of it, but a lot of backstabbing going on nonetheless, But this was happening.
Mm-hmm. So on the face of it, right, there is this bonhomie and there is this great team sort of bonding as it happens between the two rival jockeys. But behind the scenes, the knives are definitely being sharpened, right? Let's pull the lens back and talk about politics as a whole, right? And at that point of time, you were a friend of the Ray family, and you had lots of interactions, right?
Yes.
Behind the scenes and beyond the sets and way after the movie was made. What is your reading of Ray's position when it came to projecting political sentiments or his political sort of convictions on film, on celluloid?
I've not read, actually. I've seen him speak somewhere in an interview, and he was quite clear. He said, there are the definite political elements in his city trilogy, but he was happy to pose the problem, not the solution, because he's sort of, humorously retorted that if you are looking for solutions, I should probably be turning into a politician and not a filmmaker then. That was his answer.
Okay, so that's a very interesting way of putting it. Talking about which, there is this very famous film directed by James Beveridge. On the face of it, ostensibly, it shows Ray at work when he's directing Uttam Kumar and the fellow actors on the sets of Chiriyakhana. But right at the end, he does articulate his position on politics and of showing politics on celluloid. So we have the audio track for that. Let's listen to that.
I have never proposed solutions to problems because I think it's beyond my powers to do so. But as an artist, I think it is within my powers to present certain aspects as faithfully and honestly as possible so that it's brought to the consciousness of the thinking man.
So that's the famous baritone of Ray in his own words. Rochana, how deeply does this resonate with your findings and research that you've articulated in your chapter on Ray?
That was a really interesting clip that you chose to play because, as it happens, after Chiriyakhana, Mrinal Sen, one of Ray's confreres, actually accused him of selling out to the star system because because Uttam Kumar was in that movie, and as you know, he also featured in Nayok. And this would be the time when a lot of people, particularly in the left circles of Kolkata, and particularly members of the film society movement that Ray himself had helped nurture and pioneer, were almost clobbering Ray for not being political enough. And there were invariably these comparisons that were being drawn between him and Ritik Ghatak, between him and Mrinal Sen. Now, I should say at the outset that thankfully, coming many generations later, I don't bear the burden of falling into one camp or the other. I think we're actually blessed to have such a rich panoply. Having said that, I think what people tend to miss is something that was very beautifully expressed in a book called The Hundreds by my colleague Lauren Berlant and Kathleen Stewart, where they wrote, it takes a lot more than clarity to keep someone going, and there is a lot more at stake than just knowing. And I think that Ray's politics in some ways inheres in that aphorism. His politics inheres in sort of maintaining a steadfastness about not proposing easy political solutions that are channeled through a kind of a liberation theology of the left, if you will. And it's more, as he says over there, wanting to hit the pause button and not knowing for how long you're hitting the pause button, to take stock of the present. And he doesn't have any of the melodramatic resolutions, the call to almost a kind of unimaginable better future that Ritik Ghatak might have. He doesn't have the kind of 20th century global left view that Mrinal Sen has. What you have rather is this refusal to to move his sights away from the present, and like I said, to not subscribe to any of the liberation theology. And I deliberately use the two together, that the contemporary left was subscribing to. And I think that we need to dig in for a sense of history in that refusal and in that resoluteness. And I think that is an inherently political position.
Right. And as you mentioned, right? In terms of the contemporary discourse, the leftist intelligentsia was literally pillaring Ray, because for them, this was not just setting up, it was an act of betrayal to their cause, right? And that is probably because they had before them the comparison point. So you had the Ray movies, the new Ray of the city films, as compared to Mrinal Sen and Ritik Ghatak. Had it not been for the latter and the overt politicism of that, right? Maybe this comparison would have been less tough. So,
and we also have to remember that this was actually a tremendous moment in global cinema, because viewers both in Calcutta and in some parts of India, thanks to the Film Society movement, were being exposed to things like third cinema. We're being exposed to certain, to the more political currents of the French New Wave, of the Eastern European New Waves. And there was a sense in which they expected Ray, the pioneer, to embrace a certain theory of the revolution. And it seems to me that Ray would argue that we don't make the present the site from which to ask the same old questions of the past. We actually have to use the present to ask new questions of the past. And in a sense, to do that, you have to understand and know the present. And that's what his endeavor is in the city films, which I describe as a deeply political endeavor.
Right. And perhaps some of this tenuousness, right? Some of this being frozen in time, this ever-presentness or this long present, is reflected in the endings, not in Shimabodho, right? But certainly when it comes to the adversary, not in the middleman, but certainly when it comes to the adversary. And that's a very ambiguous and ambivalent ending. So, Mr. Chondo, if we compare this with what we have in Charulata, at the end, we have the two people meeting, but their hands don't exactly meet. And just before they meet, at that
the
very
hand
point,
is going there
it just
like
kills,
that.
right? It freezes into a
Right,
still,
frozen.
and that's the end. But
Yeah.
if we look at the ending that we see in the adversary, in Protignondi, this is far more potent, this is far more novel, far more flamboyant and experimental. Let's watch that clipping. Let's watch that ending. Absolutely remarkable. How do you read this particular ending, Mr. John?
I think this is one controversial endings he ever had in his movies. And even when he made this, there were a lot of discussions as to what possibly it might mean, because there are three different elements altogether. One is the fact that from the moment he escapes from the city, there is this the train shot, and he reaches this suburban township, which is quiet and nothing quite happens there after the hubbub of the city life. And when he goes there, the first thing is he hears this mysterious birds trilling, which reminds him of the sylvan happy childhood between the siblings. That was the first time they had heard it. So probably it means that he has found his peace of mind, probably. That is entirely possible. That's one aspect. The other aspect is Ram Nam Sat Hai, which is death is the ultimate reality. The film begins with death, his father's death, which is kind of sort of imprinted in his psyche. And the film ends with that. So Ray, I think, was very pleased with that kind of ambiguous ending. And there's a third element in it, Iti Siddhartha. Actually, this is the end of the epistolary, the letter that he had written to his girlfriend perpetually. That's the end. So perhaps that mysterious birds trilling, the Ram Nam Sat Hai, the death, the procession, all that is built into that letter, is being sent to her. So it's quite complicated, complicated. But this is how I see the ending.
Roshana, how about you?
The endings of all the films in the City trilogy, I think, are deeply ambiguous, because and I think I should mention that Sunil Ganguly was very skeptical initially when Ray proposed that he was going to make The Adversary, because his sense was, what is this man who knows nothing about educated unemployment, what is he going to make of, how is he going to make a film about the educated unemployed youth in Kolkata? And if you recall, he was not particularly happy with the way in which Days and Nights in the Forest had gone. However, with The Adversary, he said that this was actually a far more creative way of ending the film than I could possibly have imagined. And if you go back to the novel, you'll find that it's also strikingly different. Likewise with Shimabodho and with Jonu Aronno, where Ray actually made massive departures from the source stories on which these films were based. This is not something that's much discussed in the critical literature. People talk a lot about his departures from Vibhuti Bhushan and Rabindranath, but not from Shankar or from Sunil Ganguly. And if you recall the endings of Shimabodho and Jonu Aronno, In Shimabadhu, you actually go up, you see the fan sort of circulating, and you have Shamila and Varun Chandra sort of sitting far apart from each other in the living room. And you can see that the frisson, the spell between the two of them is broken forever. And we don't know where things are going from there.
And then she disappears.
Yes,
she disappears.
Exactly. And
Right,
then in John
and he's
Orondo,
all alone.
indeed, in John Orondo as well, there's complete and utter miscommunication between the father and son. The father actually thinks that the son has resolved all his problems, whereas the son, in effect, has become a pimp. He has just become the dalal, the expression that the middleman. So in a sense, that's a kind of irrevocable statement in some ways about the fate of the middle class. But and so to that extent, going back to my theme of present tenseness, that's the present in which we are locked in, where do we go from here? One doesn't know. So I think that the City trilogy, all of them are marked by these deeply ambiguous and complex endings.
The other thing that is very apparent, even to a casual viewer of the City trilogy, is the very strong presence of the male characters, not just the protagonist, but also the supporting cast, almost to the extent of reducing the female characters almost to kind of two-dimensional sort of cutouts, right? And this is something that you have articulated in quite great detail in that chapter, right? Because it is not as if Ray was not an extremely astute and empathetic student of the human mind, and particularly of the female mind. And we see that in so many of the movies. In one City movie, which is Mahanagar, the big city, we definitely do get a glimpse of that, more than a glimpse of that, a portrait of that. But the City trilogy, therein, gender, the treatment of gender is completely different. What's happening here?
Well, again, I don't know if, there are so many people who have written and commented on Ray, and I'm not sure that everyone will be in agreement with me, but I do want to make this point that it's as if Satyajit Ray is almost, he's saying that he doesn't get the woman in the late 60s and early 70s anymore. So if I had to, Partho Chatterjee has given us the famous nationalist resolution of the women's question theory. Now, it's almost as if by the 1960s and 70s, that sort of resolution does not hold anymore, which said that women could go out in the public, could be westernized, and yet keep certain core values. Now, his argument had been that had been cultural nationalism's solution to keeping core intact while still modernizing, if you will, or westernizing in the public domain. And in several of Ray's films, you see shades of that. You see shades of that in Charulata. I would say you see shades of that in Aarati as well, where she goes out to work. She makes these... towards the end of the film, she actually makes these serious criticisms of the racial discrimination that her Anglo-Indian colleague faces in the office, and then she just marches out of the job. So we don't have a good future yet, but in Arati's actions, that sort of future is anticipated. In the City trilogy, by contrast, we don't really know anything about the women characters. Like when you have that extraordinary scene of Siddhartha's sister dancing on the terrace and Siddhartha looking at her, it's almost as if we look at her through his eyes. The women they're almost like, they're almost parts of the male unconscious, and they appeared in fevered dreams, if you will. Kona in John Orondo, or Juthika, as she insists on being called, we actually never see her. We never see a full frontal shot of her. She's always shot. We get a side profile, and we don't really know what's making her tick. And it's almost as if this is Ray's kind of humble way of saying that he does not get the gender question anymore. So he's confining himself to a meditation on masculinity. That's what he gets, and he sees masculinity in crisis. And in some ways, I think that's what you see reflected in Siddhartha, in Shyamolendu, and in Somnath. These films are about them. He says as much, that these are actually about the men. I mean, in the Oppo trilogies, it's almost as if, all the women have to die. They don't really get a chance. But to the extent that they are there, you have a sense of what they're about. You get a sense of what makes them tick, whether it's romantic love or maternal affection, whatever it is, extreme sacrifice. In the City trilogy, we don't. These are not films about women. And to that extent, I think we should ask, why aren't they? Why did a man who actually... Varunda wants to say something. Yeah.
Yeah, please.
No, you carry on, and then I have something to say about
I was
this.
about to say, right, because Roshana said that not everyone might agree, and I have a feeling Mr. Chandra doesn't. He possibly has a slightly dissenting point of view. Go ahead.
You are blaming Ray for something that he wasn't doing. He said so. I mean, just one second. Just let me finish this. If Ray were to make a film today, the Shimabadda film today, you'd probably have a protagonist called Shamoli Chatterjee and not Shamalindu, because today the reality, the truth is entirely different. You have any number of female CEOs going around today in India and everywhere else. But in the early 60s and late 60s, women were relegated in the office world to being the stenographer and the secretary and that kind of stuff. And he reflected that reality. Now, if you ask for something more, I think that's entirely wrong, because he wasn't, if you ask for a peacock, you can't get another bird. And you say that, no, actually, I'm looking for that bird.
Right? So if I just interject, perhaps it's fair to say that in the City trilogy, so take Shimabadda, for example, right? Company Limited. The female characters are sketchy. They are fairly opaque. They are not well fleshed out. And the entire plot, right, except for the treatment, he is probably fairly faithful to the way that the women are not fleshed out in these novels, as opposed to the psychological complexity in their male counterparts.
Barring Shimabadda, perhaps, because in Shimabadda, Tutul is actually, it has been said quite often that she happens to be not just an actor, she also happens to be the conscience of the hero. I would say that Shimabadda, at least as far as Tutul is concerned, the sister-in-law, she has a definitive role to play in the movie. And if you look at the beginning or towards the beginning, the handing over of the watch and the return of the watch, right at the end, it comes a full cycle. And the watch becomes, in fact, the leitmotif in the film. And I don't think that he's been unkind to women, not at least in Shimabadda, because Tutul is essential, is not peripheral.
Roshana, you had a point.
Yeah, I'm just going to make a little footnote, which is just two things. One is, it's not at all my suggestion that Ray is being unkind or to blame him in any way. I think, in fact, it's a very important gesture, a gesture in humility, I may add, where I think he's giving up on the women's question. And going back to Borunda's point about there not being women CEOs and so forth, let me just leave you with a question, which is that in the original novel, the novel ends with Shamalandu and his wife Dolon driving Tutul to the airport because she's actually going to New Delhi to join the Indian Administrative Service. In the film,
that's right.
We have none of that, So this is emphatically not a film about women's careers. And the interesting question to ask is, well, why did he make that change? Why was this so solely focused on male careers. And again, we cannot, we can never give a definitive answer as to why that is, but to me that's a very interesting symptom. And for me it's a symptom of him saying that I think women are ciphers at this time, and I don't really get the modern woman in the way that I get modern men.
We'll leave it at that because there's lots more to cover. And
Fair
one
enough.
of the things
Fair
we're
enough.
talking about is the music of Ray, right? And Mr. Chondo, we talked about this earlier. When Ray begins his film career, he's essentially a filmmaker. He's not a composer. So he relies, and there's this great collaboration, right? Absolutely fantastic, by now legendary collaboration with Pandit Ravi Shankar, with Ustad Vilayat Khan, with Ustad Ali Akbar Khan, right? On a series of movies.
Yeah.
But thereafter, he comes into his own as a composer, as an orchestrator, as a conductor, as somebody who is literally working with every single person, right? Arranging the instrumentation, the orchestration, writing down the scores by hand for every single instrumentalist, and overseeing that end to end, if you will, of the music making, not just the filmmaking, right? And something that was really, really fascinating for me, having been through most of the sort of title sequences, is the one for Shima Bodho. Let's watch that. That is just so unusual. Talk to us about it. What's your reading of it?
You want my opinion?
Mhm.
Hello, Avik?
Yes. Yes.
You were asking me the question? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
I think when it comes to Shima Bodho, the pre-title, the first few minutes has more than 500 shots. So it's not just the music; it's a whole lot of other things. I might sound like digressing, but I'm not. I'm just expanding upon the thought that it is not just music; it's the photography, the sound effects, and the editing. All things sort of coalesce into a kind of seamless movement all through the title part. The title comes actually a little later. The first part is the soliloquy. So
Yes.
so it comes a little later. But the first half is infinitely complicated. That first pre-title sequence. And if you were to analyze even the title, a whole lot of things are happening all the time. Sort of, the sound of that old computer sound, and then the face being relegated here, the blank part, the titles coming here, and then a female hand coming here, the Red Cross badge, he's shaking out money, and then traveling again, the telephone call, whole lot of things happening. And then the title is over. You see that he was actually flipping through the Time magazine, and he looks around and said, I've reached the office.
So it's actually a very
it
complex.
is not just the music, the way he uses the music almost as it is a kind of sound effect. Dum, 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 dum. That is really really marvelous, and it is also very simple. But what I was trying to say is that the entire impact is the fusion of 3 or 4 elements, and because Ray was himself the conductor of everything, not just the music, the photography, the sound effects, everything was his own choice.
The editing as well.
So that he could match everything and sort of synchronize everything into a seamless whole.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Great. So which takes us to another facet of the way that Ray used music, and that is his use of Robindra Songit. Now, if we look at an earlier movie, such as Charulata, his use of Robindra Songit is fairly traditional, in the sense that it was traditional of someone like Pankaj Mollik, who introduced that and really popularized it across the many movies where he both acted and was the music director. It is kind of a continuation of that. However, when we come to the City trilogy, in particular, when we are talking about the middleman, his use of Robindra Songit is not just unusual, it's iconoclastic, possibly, in a way, right? Let's watch. Rochana, what's your take on this very remarkable treatment?
I mean, this is, Ray establishing himself as the modernist filmmaker par excellence, because as you know, there's a deep history of Robindra Songit in Bengal. People like Dipesh Chakraborty, Sudipta Kobiraj have all written about how it provides a resource in the lives of middle-class Bengalis. In Ray's other films too, we've seen that, as you said, this very conventional use of Robindra Songit either in Charulata, in other films. Mm-hmm. Here, you have a song which is associated with Rabindranath's, nature poetry. It belongs to the Prakriti Porja. It's a monsoon song. It talks about the beauty of the rain clouds. It talks about if we listen to the whole song, we would have heard that, it talks about the flowers that blossom during the monsoons. Now he takes this utterly romantic song and sort of transmogrifies it into background noise. It actually, in a sense, this idea came to me when I first heard or when Mamata Banerjee actually began this business of playing Robindra Songit at traffic signals. And very often you'd have to strain your ears to actually make out what the words were. Now, we all know that with Robindra Songit, one pays attention to the words. It's all about cultivating a certain ethic of listening. Now, Ray sort of takes that and in one kind of shattering stroke, destroys that particular legacy of Robindra Songit, because this becomes the soundtrack for load shedding, and in a sense, it becomes the soundtrack for the complete and utter destruction of the Nehruvian dream. Where Gadgil, the power minister, had once declared that electricity is going to be the lifeblood of the modern industrial nation. It has to be available in abundant quantity. Now, this is a Calcutta of power cuts. In a sense, it's actually anticipating the massive sort of crisis in power that we find ourselves in. That's where he inserts a Tagore song. And again, we need to ask, why does he do this? I mean, as we know that later on in Ghore Baire, he goes back to Home and the World. He goes back to a much more conventional use. But in this, in Jono Aronnoy, it's actually the only film in the trilogy that has songs. There's a lot of music in the trilogy, but it's only in Jono Aronnoy that we have a bhajan, and then we have this particular Robindra Songit. And I think that this is a very modernist use of a particular romantic legacy in Bengali poetry and music.
Great. So this is the segment. We've got around 15 minutes to go. And this is the segment where we're going to start taking some questions, some very interesting questions posed by the viewers, the live audience. So maybe have the first question. So Chandok is asking, and this is something that both of you mentioned, but let's delve into that a little bit deeper. So Mr. Chondo first, and then Rochana, talking about some of the leitmotifs in the City movies. Does anything in particular spring to mind in Pratidwandi, for example, or Shimabodho?
Pratidwandi, first of all, the mysterious birds trilling that is a leitmotif for certain. That is actually the main leitmotif, to my mind, in the adversary, the Pratidandi. And in Shimabodho, you have the watch. In a way, everything evolves around that watch. Tutul comes to Calcutta to stay with Shyamulendu and her elder sister, and she doesn't have the time because her watch is not functioning or something or the other. So he gives her the watch, and by accepting it, it is almost like accepting him. And when the moment she accepts it, the audience would perhaps sort of dread that sometime or the other this watch is going to be returned, and what's going to happen then? And that is the entire tragedy. The watch returns and she goes out. She goes out of frame. She goes out of his life. And that is the greatest tragedy at the moment of the height of success. So that is again a leitmotif. And then you have elsewhere also he uses visual symbols for an entire movie.
Indeed. Rochana, what's your view on this?
Well, one of the themes that I think that keeps recurring is the interview. And I remember in a previous conversation, I think Borunda had mentioned that an abiding theme in not just the City trilogy, but in all of Ray up until this point, is the theme of work. And I feel like work, or the shortage of it, kind of reaches a crisis point with the City trilogy. And I think we all remember the extraordinary interview sequences, not just in Pratidandi, the reference to the Vietnam War is super famous, but actually the last, towards the Pratidandi is flanked by 2 deaths. It's also flanked by 2 interviews. And the last interview is one that actually doesn't happen. John Oronno is also, there are some there's a remarkable interview sequence at the beginning of John Oronno, and that's almost like, this is the death of the salary.
The weight of the moon.
Yeah.
And weight of the
moon.
Is that valid for my job? Yeah, quite right.
And then in Shimabodho, the film actually begins with, in this case, a successful interview. But if you remember, it starts with this scene, or there is this scene of people milling about.
Employment exchange.
Exactly. So to me, that's the most abiding and in some ways the most kind of haunting memory I have of Bengali youth in search of jobs. That, and aside from that, of course, there are many other things: the crumbling infrastructure, the road shedding,
the valid point,
road rage, and just the walk. If you recall, there's a lot of low-key lighting in Shimabodho and Pratidandi, and it's almost as if he wants to hammer home the point. Low-key lighting, as well as shots of processions, like bird's eye view of this massive procession. So it's almost like incarnating Kolkata as the city of power shortages, of
strife, of unrest, of dissent.
The youth.
And this is undertone, right? So going back to that quote and going back to that audio track that we heard. So he is not proposing solutions, but he's definitely putting it out there. He's posing the important problem out there, right?
Chidananda Dashgupta once said that, in Ray films, you don't get Calcutta of burning trams, of riots. I actually think you do. What you don't get are any easy solutions about how to escape that Kolkata. But in fact, you get a whole lot of that. You actually, this was the 70s. If you pay attention to the graffiti that you see in these films, China's chairman is our chairman, the 70s are the decade of liberation, and just the ways in which the male protagonists are positioned vis-a-vis those graffitis. It's almost like sometimes they don't even pay any attention. And
Absolutely.
so to me,
I
those are
was
some
thinking, Rochana, even in Shimabodho, to your point, even in Shimabodho, right? So on the face of it, we have this almost perfect, picture perfect veneer of the corporate world, and people just going up to, working up the way up the ladder till they come very close to the boardroom, and then the rival jockeys fighting it out. But there is also this subtle, fairly quiet subtext of the cocoon, right? The 8th floor and looking out onto the city, and it looks so peaceful, except that there are gunshots and there are shots, and you can't even distinguish whether it's gunfire or it's
exploding
in the night, right?
Bombs
and
exploding.
That is there constantly. And even during the party scene, there is the explosion that's happening in the background, right?
Right.
Perfect. There is another question which I thought was very interesting, that from Kaushik Banerjee. Can we have that up, please? All right. So this is a very interesting one. So Roshana, I'll come to you first, right? Because we're talking about the lack of historicism, right? And the question is saying, can we look at it today in hindsight? Can we look at that as Shimabodho as a kind of period piece, a chronicle of times?
I think they're all period pieces in that sense. Now the question is, oftentimes when we describe something as a historical period piece, there is actually underlying that is the question of, well, what is history? And in previous films, I think what you get is a very definite sense of history as a forward movement in time. In Satyajit Ray, so whether it's a history talking about changes in family structure, in expectations of romantic love, in the transition from village to city, you get a very from, say, feudal to modern, from a kind of collective living to a more individual autonomous living.
Or for that matter, a very tectonic shift, right? As in Jolchagod, there is, the slow and unnatural death of the aristocracy, right?
Right. And I think
no worries.
And in the films, I think in the previous films, you also, let me be clear about this, that not for a second does Ray suggest that this developmental arc is without its tension, without its pain, without its fissures. In fact, that's what the films show, how tormented and tortured the process of development can be. The city films, I think, are extraordinary period pieces precisely because here we have someone refusing, if you will, to pass that historicist arc, and almost sort of fessing up to his inability to do so.
Mr. Chandra?
Yeah. Not all of them, I think, because I think John Orono is still remarkably contemporary in the sense that the hunt for jobs, the role of the middleman, and the politician sort of doling out jobs or money or this or that as enticement to win votes. It's very much there. It's more than I think it's more true today than any time in the history of India today. This is what's happening. So John Orono, I'm not sure if it's a period piece. It is part of it is very, very current, absolutely contemporary, raw, gripping. Well, that's my take.
If you take it from that point of view, and I'll add my 2 pence here, because I come from the corporate world as well. The machinations have become far more complex, but the rivalries, the cutthroat competitiveness is not of Shimabodho is not just very much there. It's increased manifold. I can attest to that. Right. There is another very interesting question from Shonok that I saw earlier. Can we have that question? Yeah. All right. So this takes us. Right. So Rochana, maybe you want to take a stab at this.
To read the question. So the question says, the Opal trilogy is undeniably a complex and nuanced account of India's encounter with modernity. would you consider the Calcutta trilogy to be, in terms of both the thematic concerns as well as the cinematic language and interrogation of the failed promises of modernity as expressed by a post-colonial nation state? I think that's a very good question. I would perhaps just rejig it
Very
a little
interesting
bit.
question.
That it is the City trilogy is actually a meditation on post-coloniality and on on post-colonial time. And again, going back to this distinction that I'm making, that if the Opu trilogy was a narrative of developmental time, where you have time that's forward moving, that's moving from, say, one condition to another, feudal to modern, all of that. In the City trilogy, time stalls. And no, it's a failure of modernization, for sure. The promises of modernization, whether in terms of infrastructure, whether in terms of medical services. If you recall, there's this bit in John Orono where his friend is really ill and takes these is unable to go to a doctor, like he says viral hoche, and pops some pills. It's a failure of the promises of employment. You have joblessness on the rise, corruption. So to that extent, it is a failure of modernization. And in its stalled temporality, I think it's a deep meditation on what happens to post-colonial time as you go from the history of Nehruvian development onto this post-Nehruvian period. And I think what Ray is inviting us to do, in a certain sense, I think it anticipates what the anthropologist David Scott, in a book called Conscripts of Modernity, says, that when the promises of third world liberation have left us nowhere and they've all failed, we need to take stock of the post-colonial present to see what questions to ask of the past. And I think that that's what the City trilogy actually does very, very effectively, 20 years before the historian anthropologist does so, or maybe 30 years actually.
Absolutely. We are getting very close to stoppage time. Maybe we'll have time for a last question. Can we have Ishani's question, maybe? All right. Okay. So this is going away definitely from the City trilogy, which is the main focus of our work, right? So this is going back to the Ray more traveled, or the Ray most traveled, and perhaps we could end with that. So Rochana, would you like to take a pass at this? So first of all, do you agree that that had at that point of time created necessarily a serene vibe, as opposed to something which eulogizes poverty?
Far from it.
No. I mean, serenity is probably not the word I would use. I mean, sure, there's not there's always a lot of empathy in Ray, but Pather Pachali is actually it's a profound film. It's also a profoundly sad film, because it's when he said that in a village almost nothing happens, in fact a lot does. And what you see are these battles. You see lives lost. I mean, Indi Thakur's death, Durga's death, Opu's chucking into the water the little necklace that his sister had stolen, is actually one of the most profoundly sad scenes in all of my experience of cinema. And so serenity is not how I would describe it. It's actually, Raymond Ballur actually once talked about films that accompany us, and he was talking about Megheta Katara. I would say that Pather Pachali and Oporajito are actually two films that accompany me. They're very hard to ever let go. And whenever you go back to them, you actually see them with new eyes. So thank you for your question. Thank you for letting me share that little bit. Yeah, that's what I would say.
So Mr. Chondo, just before we sign off, let me rephrase that question for you, because this is something that came up during some of our discussions earlier. What did Pathe Pachali mean to Western audiences and Western aficionados? How was Ray received?
To the
particularly
Western world?
America, to the Western world, let's say in America.
It was mind-boggling to them. And in MoMA, I think the Museum of Modern Art, where it was first shown in Chicago or New York, a Museum of Modern Arts, MoMA, and it just created a kind of they just couldn't believe this, what was happening over there. The poverty hit them sort of, the solar plexus kind of thing. And he was hailed. You have a lot of expat Italians settled down in America. So, and a whole lot of them are into the filmmaking as well. And they hailed him as the Robert Flaherty of India. Robert Flaherty at that time was at least regarded in the Western world as the final documentary maker, the ultimate documentary maker. And Ray was compared on the strength of this single one movie that he was the Robert Flaherty of the East. It shook them up. It shook them up, absolutely.
Right. And just from my understanding, that initial viewing, that very first viewing, did it really have subtitles? Do you recall? Did it have subtitles?
It didn't.
It didn't, right? Exactly.
No, it didn't.
So they had to just see whatever was in front of them and infer the entire, not just the emotions
Absolutely.
that all the characters were going through, but the story, the narrative in itself, and everything that was happening. Fascinating. It has been a really, really engrossing talk, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And viewers, I know there may be a few more questions that we haven't been able to take up, but we have been able to answer quite a few. And I hope you all enjoyed this inaugural episode of Chicago Dialogues. We are going to be back. So this is a part of a series, which is one episode per month. We're going to be back on the 17th of October. I'm not going to tell you the topic or the guests, so we'll keep you in suspense on that. But until then, stay safe. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.